Sag ich genau jetzt. Welcome to Pax Europiana, the podcast about peace in Europe. And I'm very honored to have a very special guest for the interview today. It's Ambassador Wolfgang Petritsch, one of the great Austrian diplomats who contributed to Balkan peace in the 90s and in the early 2000s in many important positions, among them as Austrian ambassador to Serbia from 97, then later as the EU special envoy to the Kosovo peace talks in Rambouillet, and then from 99 onwards to 2002 as the High Representative in Bosnia. These are really very important positions at a decisive time for the Balkans, and I'm very honored to have you here on the show. Ambassador, please, can you present yourself to the audience and start with that, please?
Very glad to be invited. Thank you very much for your kindness. And yeah, let's have a look into our past.
Ambassador, one small message also, please, the hands, not at the microphone, because some people, they listen to it and then it's too loud for that one. Thanks a lot. I would like to come back to the early years. You were appointed 97 as the Austrian ambassador in Belgrade at a very important time. Serbia was already in I think the Kosovo war started 97 as well when you started in Belgrade. In Montenegro, there was also the big struggle for independence beginning in 97. What was your first measures and how did you experience the situation in 97 when you arrived to Belgrade?
Well, actually, in 97, there was a certain hope and confidence that after the peace in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Dayton Peace Accords in late 1995, where Mr. Milosevic, the president of Yugoslavia, because it was still the third Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro at the time, was extremely helpful in bringing peace to Bosnia-Herzegovina. Of course, there were many, many compromises. But in general, the hope was that now the war actually in Bosnia and in extension also in other parts of Yugoslavia has come to an end. Unfortunately, this was not the case. There is a certain amount of responsibility on the part of the international community because in Dayton, where the Kosovo Albanians, Mr. Rugova and his team were pushing very hard to be included in this peace deal in Dayton. Obviously, that didn't happen. And so the patience on the part of particularly the younger generation in Kosovo ran out. And they started basically in 1998, an armed uprising against Belgrade. And only then, once the international community saw that there is actually an armed resistance, the attention shifted to Kosovo. This is very unfortunate. This is why I said there is a certain responsibility of the part of the international community, because the peaceful approach, the civic resistance, the peaceful resistance on the part of Mr. Rugova was not honored. Yeah? And here you can see this kind of situation where only once the military takes over in international relations, public attention, international attention, political media attention, then is focused on this uprising. So in 1998, 3 years after Dayton, actually I was there, the Austrian ambassador, 97, as you said, it started. And very soon it became clear that the Kosovo issue is boiling up. So while many thought that actually Bosnia is the end of the escalation, of the military escalation, they were wrong. And so in 98, it started the uprising, the military from then Yugoslavia, rump Yugoslavia, and the special police forces, they went after the KLA, the UČK, the armed resistance there, and that is how the situation actually then came back to a warlike event, and this was when I was then in October of '98 appointed by the European Union to be the EU Special Envoy for Kosovo, working together with the American Special Envoy, Chris Hill. We did, as of October, November of '98 beginning, we did a so-called shuttle diplomacy. We had a peace proposal and we shuttled between Belgrade and Pristina. We spoke to one side, we spoke to the other side. We tried to sort of hammer out a compromise. And at the time, of course, it was not about independence. We need to keep in mind that it was the so-called Balkan contact group, United States and the big European powers, plus Russia, who were organizing and driving the peace process. And the American Special Envoy and I for the European Union, we were, so to speak, those on the ground who tried to bring this escalating conflict to a close.
On the 5th of March 98, there was the so-called Yashari Brekas massacre. It was a terrible 23 people, all in all 58 people, I think, died. And it was a terrible deed. How did this news reach you and how did the international community react?
Well, I still remember very vividly that this was a real shock, came as a real shock to the diplomatic community in Belgrade, to the European Union, of course, and the United States. But it's such a brutal action. Actually, a family was wiped out. There was for quite a few days. There were fights there, and of course the Serb special forces destroyed basically the houses there, killed the families who lived there, children, older people, whatever. And I remember we went there a few days later to visit the site in order to get the first-hand impression and also to signal to Belgrade this is being taken seriously by the international community. Unfortunately, that didn't really, this message did not really impress Mr. Milosevic at the time, so things escalated. And then only in mid-January of 1999, when another such massacre happened in Racak, there, although in the meantime, and we can talk about it, many positive things have happened. Compromises were found, the OSCE came in, an observer mission and so on. Nevertheless, this massacre in Racak then was actually this kind of a point of no return. From then on, it was clear to the international community, either there's immediate military intervention, or we give it a last try in negotiating, and that this is how Rambouillet then happened.
In the summer of '89, there was Holbrooke and Christopher Hill. They were going to Kosovo to also talk to the UÇK. What was your impression about this mission, and how were the first contacts with the UÇK established in order to find a peaceful settlement?
Well, it was very interesting when the Americans, who were first actually and in the lead, so to speak, you know, the Europeans are always much slower. So they actually, Mr. Holbrooke went and sat down. This is this famous photograph with a local UÇK leader, and who claimed that he's actually the UÇK leader, yeah? Which was not the case. That was a bit of an embarrassing situation. So when we Europeans, then in the fall of the same year, we tried via our personal contacts in Pristina, like Veton Suroy, some journalists, to find out who actually is the leadership of the KLA. And so this is how, pretty much the same time with the Americans, because we're working together, we found out that actually it must be a group of 3, 4, 5 people who had a greater responsibility on the part of the KLA. Now you need to keep in mind, the KLA was relatively young in terms of uh, um, fighting and organizational issues and so on. And they were extremely organized in a very, in such a way that there was no real, how should I say, one person command, like this is the case when it comes to an ordinary military or well-organized military. It was so that the regional fighters, they kind of coordinated, but it was not really a very strong and professional KLA that we were confronted with. Now, on the one hand, this was, if I may say so, a bit easier because we thought, okay, this is only at the beginning. We can still, when something is just about to be built up, we can still intervene and see that we get them away from fighting. On the other hand, it was more difficult because, as I mentioned, they were not well organized. Yeah, to whom to talk was a big issue. Yeah? And I still remember we had, it was in early 1999, we had already several meetings with with various local and regional leaders. We were talking with them, trying to find out what they want to do. Of course, also we were working on a humanitarian basis, saying, well, there's so many refugees and IDPs, we want to look after them. I remember I was traveling also with the EU Commissioner for Refugees, Madame Bonino in Italian, in order to see what can be done so that the civilian population will not suffer too much. Yeah. But then when in early 1999, the KLA took a group of Yugoslav soldiers hostage. And so I was, as the European Union Special Envoy and the American envoy, we were asked to help Belgrade to free these Yugoslav soldiers. And we were talking to the KLA, of course. Yeah? And the KLA said, well, several messages came to us basically asking for a prisoner exchange. Yeah? Clearly, Belgrade did not want a prisoner exchange. So we figured out a way to kind of get first the Yugoslav soldiers free, and then I got a promise from the Deputy Prime Minister in Belgrade that 10 days after, seemingly unrelated, they would release some KLA fighters who were imprisoned in Belgrade or in Kosovo. So, of course, this was a high risk because I basically could only rely on the word given to me by a Belgrade official. And so when we reached this stage in our negotiations, it was happening somewhere out there in the woods, I would say, there was a certain agreement. Yes, we could accept this, but you still have to contact a person. And this person was Mr. Thaci. And for me, the advantage was that Mr. Thaci at the time did not spoke German very well, yeah, but no English. So I had a privilege actually in all these contacts that I, as the only German-speaking Americans, the British, and so on, I could talk to him directly. So when I was connected with him, I explained to him what our proposal was, and he said, "Yeah, okay, I can agree." So this was for me a signal that Mr. Fauci has an important role. Yeah, not I didn't know whether it was the top role, the top position. Now, in retrospect, we know that, as I said before, it was highly decentralized. So he was one of few who actually had an important word to say in all of this. Now, the interesting thing is, it happened. The KLA agreed. The Yugoslav soldiers were freed. And 4 days later, Ratchak happened.
How
And
did
that
you
was,
hear the news of Ratchak? It was in January 99, and there was
yes,
Ambassador Walker. How this news reached you, and what was your reaction?
we were at a time with Chris Hill traveling because we also had to inform the foreign ministers of the contact group. So we're traveling somewhere, I guess it was London. We had a foreign ministers conference, and we reported about our efforts to negotiate and where the problems lie and so on. And this is where the news reached us. Yeah? And so I actually thought, so, okay, now this is over. This deal with the Yugoslavs have their hostages freed, but they will not give up the KLA prisoners. So I called up the deputy prime minister and said, I hope that you stick to your word. And interestingly, to my surprise, he said, yes, I will. So that was the interesting thing. But at the same time, of course, Ratchak was, as I said before, the last signal. We cannot just go on and negotiate by traveling back and forth while the war situation escalated more and more. That was then decided to invite both sides.
Now, I'm not sure I'm hearing, I have no sound at the moment, but
Walker.
maybe, yes, I hear you again. So please, Ambassador.
Ambassador Walker was the head of the KVM mission, Kosovo verification mission, which was established after Mr. Holbrooke was able to strike a deal with Mr. Milosevic, where such an OSCE mission could be established in Kosovo. Now, this was already quite some success on for the international community, because till the middle of 98, it was clear and clearly expressed on the part of Mr. Milosevic and his government, Kosovo is an internal, a domestic issue. We will not allow international mingling. And you know what happened? In June, in the middle of June, Mr. Milosevic traveled to Moscow and met with President Yeltsin. And at the time, the situation between Russia and the West, of course, was much more relaxed than it is today. And Mr. Yeltsin actually and the Russians were helpful to convince Mr. Milosevic to let international observers into Kosovo. And this happened then indeed in July, August of 98. And that was the first step. The second step then was the Walker mission, the OSCE mission. Before this, it was the so-called KDOM, Kosovo Diplomatic Observer Mission, it was called. And it was basically for Russian, European, and American diplomats posted in Belgrade to travel to Kosovo and see how the situation is, so that they could make their own picture of what was happening there. So that was even this for me was really the breakthrough. This is how the situation in Kosovo was internationalized. And it's interesting to say, and you have to stress this today, nowadays, that it was Russia which helped in this. Yeah? Of course, it was 1998, 1999, so it was well before Crimea, well before the new Cold War started. And it tells you that how important it is now to have a diplomatic understanding and a political understanding. If you want to resolve an issue, it can be very small, comparatively, globally speaking, this is a small issue, Kosovo, but you need the good services and the positive commitment on the part of all those who are involved, particularly clearly of the UN Security Council, the veto powers. Yeah? That's important. And this worked at the time in 98, 99. And I must say also in the negotiations then in Rambouillet, it was a Russian who was the third negotiator, apart from Mr. Hill and myself. It was Boris Mayorsky, a top Russian diplomat, and we, the three together, we formed a sort of a negotiating troika. Again, I want to stress without how much more difficult it is today to find a solution, to find a compromise, because of the fact that globally speaking, we are confronted with a new sort of Cold War, new confrontation between the West and Russia.
Mr. Ambassador, in October 98, you were appointed the EU Special Envoy for Kosovo. Austria by itself was only 3 years at that moment in the European Union. And to my best knowledge, you were the first Austrian to be appointed EU Special Envoy. And also, by the way, because not everybody will know that, you also had a very big role in getting Austria into the European Union. And thanks a lot for also these services. Yeah. But the thing is now about the Balkans. The situation is, how was it to be appointed first time to speak for the whole European Union as an Austrian diplomat from neutral Austria? How was that happening? And how was your role then with the American negotiator and the Russian negotiator in Rambouillet?
Well, it was quite an experience because there was no common foreign policy at the time in the European Union to speak of. There was no high representative for the European common foreign and security policy. Yeah? So actually it was the commissioner, European Commissioner for Foreign Relations. At the time it was a British Lord Patten. And actually, that was quite interesting. The appointment, my appointment, was actually made in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September 98. All the foreign ministers met there. And the Americans were already quite critical at the time, saying, well, the situation in Kosovo is escalating, and what do the Europeans actually do? They have no special envoy, they just wait again for the Americans, or what is it? So it was this kind of critical voice coming from Washington, which actually sped up the whole process. And at the time, it was quite interesting because, I mean, Austria had a EU presidency, the rotating presidency. So I actually already had a certain special role to play in Kosovo. Yeah, with the organization of what I said before, Kosovo Diplomatic Observer Mission, then the KVM and so on. So I was known with the other ambassadors from the European Union, in particular by the Americans. So, and there was a certain competition between an Italian candidate and a French candidate. And then it's always difficult, you know, what is the compromise then? You don't want to hurt the Italians, you don't want to hurt the French. And then the German foreign minister, Mr. Kinkel at the time said, well, why don't we take the Austrian ambassador in Belgrade Austria is holding the EU presidency, so we can do this. And of course, so this is how it was resolved. But that was already in October. So the Germans, who were next to become the EU president, the rotating presidency, Mr. Kinkel thought, okay, the Austrians should do it 2 months, and then we have the special envoy, which did not happen because after 2-3 months, till the end of December, obviously, the others in Brussels and the Americans, they liked what I was doing. And so the Germans could not just simply say, thank you, Mr. Petritsch, we are now going to have a German special envoy. And this is how I remained in this position.
And this was this historic role in Rambouillet, this last minute's efforts to keep peace and have a peaceful settlement, your direct contribution to this one. Maybe you can explain what happened in Rambouillet and how things have rolled out in this decisive 3 weeks of March 99.
Yes, this was clearly one of the most challenging times for me, I must say, particularly since the escalation of the violence and killing and so on in Kosovo itself was very fast. Yeah? And so the OSCE mission actually was, well, they did not even have the 1,500 people that were originally decided by the OSCE to. It's always a big problem to get the member states to contribute personnel, to contribute money and all this stuff. It's a very cumbersome situation. So when we then when we decided, and this was a decision really taken by the contact group, Europeans, Americans, and Russians, we need now a conference. This cannot go on. We need to stop the fighting. We need a ceasefire, and then we take the two sides to a place, and then, you know, like in Dayton 4 years earlier, and then we try to get a compromise signed by both sides. Now, the initiative came from the French, a joint initiative by the French foreign minister and Monsieur Védrine, and by the British foreign minister. And we had a meeting at a time for this decision in London, in Chatham House. And then the French said, well, we can offer Rambouillet. This is the hunting castle of our president, and that we can offer to do this there. And then came the decision who is going to chair this meeting. And so the French and the foreign minister said they would be the co-chairs. And then the next question was, but who is actually going to conduct the negotiations? And then the American Secretary of State, Ms. Allred, said, well, we can offer for this job Chris Hill. He's already well into this topic. And then without waiting for the Europeans, she said, and Chris has worked so well with Wolfgang, I think that the two of them should do it. And the Germans were looking at each other because the Germans wanted, actually, they wanted Mr. Ischinger to be the negotiator and I to remain the EU special envoy, because these were formally two separate jobs. And it was the new government with Mr. Fischer, Foreign Minister Fischer was there, Joschka Fischer, and he was kind of taken by surprise, but did not oppose. This is how it happened. But of course, I mean, this was really, for me, a shoestring operation, whereas Chris Hill always traveled with an American airplane, had generals around him and advisors, experts, lawyers, and so on. I was actually always basically with two people, one German and in Austria now the current ambassador to Rome, Jan Kickert, was at the time a very young attaché, and he was actually my assistant, German and another German. So that was this. Here you could see that the European foreign policy, of course, was not in place yet. And it took Brussels many months, to just to pay what I had to spend in travel fees. Only a year later, in 2000, the Brussels finally reimbursed my travel fees because the bureaucracy there was such that nobody before me had done in such a short period of time such a job. And in fact, historically speaking, this is for future historians also interesting, I was the third EU special envoy only being appointed in the history of the European Union. There was one for the Middle East and one for Africa, and I was the third. So here you can imagine that the bureaucracy in Brussels simply didn't know what to do, how to handle the situation. And this, as we know, even today, 20 years on, it is always very difficult for Brussels to react in an evolving situation. When a crisis breaks out, the first weeks and months are terrible. We can see this now with the vaccine stuff, and we've seen this, of course, in the Middle East. Wherever there's a war, it takes, or an urgent situation, the European Union is always extremely slow. So what I did, basically, I worked very closely with the Germans because they had an EU presidency, and I basically took from wherever I could get help and assistance in order to manage the situation. And the interesting thing was, maybe this I should mention because it just comes to my mind, clearly the media were reporting extremely frequently about the conference in Rambouillet, and there was a long immediately after the end of the conference in Rambouillet, there was a long, deep and analytical report in Die Zeit about Rambouillet, and they were able to use the German documents from Rambouillet. And then actually they wrote that this time the Europeans with Mr. Petritsch were much more up to the level of the Americans. It was not like in Dayton, where the Europeans didn't play a role. That was already a first important step of a common European foreign policy, again on in view of this conference, of this peace conference.
I guess that your excellent personal contacts with the Kosovo and with the Serbian leadership were really very decisive in Rambouillet and also very helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, there were several factors, and this is, I believe, so important to recognize. You need to have a very in-depth historical knowledge. That's very important, because otherwise you do not know why are they fighting, what are they doing, how far does it go back. Then of course there are lots of mythologies and lots of false facts that are being the propaganda that works. You have to look through this mess through it in a way. It is like it is like traveling without a light in the darkness. And then and the second, for me, very important point was, you need to try to be as objective as possible, and you need to respect the people involved in this process. Arrogance or things that where you do not respect the people, that doesn't work. That's so important. And of course, it was also quite interesting. It was clear from the outset, one thought, that the Americans were very much pro Kosovars. Yeah, naturally, everybody thought the Russians are on the side of the Serbs, but where are the Europeans? Yeah, and actually, I managed to kind of be respected by both sides. And clearly, you have mentioned already before, a small neutral country, yeah, a diplomat coming from a small country. We don't have big power interests. We don't have huge economic interests. What we want is, actually, this is our neighborhood. We want a peaceful solution, and we want respect for all sides involved. Yeah? And that was also recognized by the Serbs as well as by the Kosovo Albanians. And it's still the case. I was only 2 years ago or so at a conference in Belgrade. And clearly this is still a huge traumatic issue in Belgrade. And I gave them my account of the situation there. And they were some also professors were quite shocked because of the propaganda, of the Serb propaganda. They did not have the real story. Yeah, but in the end, if there is eventually a solution and a compromise for Kosovo, all the historic facts, all the things that were done or not done, the mistakes that were made, have to come on the table. Yeah? Only once you have this feeling, okay, I wasn't treated always in the right way, but they were trying to. Yeah? This will eventually settle the situation, but I must say we're still far away from it.
When President Milutinovic, he led the Serbian delegation to Rambouillet, and he was he was considering to sign, but then he left the delegation and the negotiation. What was your feeling? Did you think that it can be still saved and the agreement can be reached also with the Serbian side in the last minute at the end of March?
Well, of course, I was quite skeptical for one main reason. All the successful peace accords were closed after a military intervention. Yeah? Here, it was the first time in living history that we were confronted with a situation where there was no intervention, no military intervention from outside. Yeah? And we know that a compromise is reached only if both sides realize they cannot get more. Yeah? And so in this way, it was a situation in Rambouillet where of course the Kosovo Albanian side thought we want independence. Yeah? But this was not offered. It was high degree of autonomy, but no independence. On the other hand, you had Belgrade, and Belgrade thought that they could win the war against the KLA. So that was the problem. Yeah, and in the end, it was a miscalculation on the part of Mr. Milosevic, who did not sign, and a miscalculation in many ways also on the part of NATO, because both sides thought, okay, there might be now a short war, but then it's going to be over, and the situation, the status quo will remain. That was the hope of Mr. Milosevic, and the fear, of course, of NATO. And here you can see, once you go into a war situation, it escalates, and it is extremely difficult to plan the end, the exit from a war. Yeah, you see this now in Afghanistan. 20 years, So of course, no victory. This is a lost war. But the Americans are leaving because they know they are not going to win, even if they stay another 20 years. So that was the fear on the part of NATO. How long will NATO keep together? And we know that particularly Greece, but also Italy, there's certain sympathies for Belgrade, traditional sympathies, that nobody was sure whether they are going to stay in continue to support the NATO intervention or not. Yeah? So that was this kind of tricky situation actually, and for this was the idea on the part of Milosevic. He thought, okay, we are going to be bombed now, but eventually we will NATO will stop, and then this is already a victory for me. Yeah. And of course, he miscalculated. It did not happen. And of course, we know the rest is history.
There was this dramatic last-minute mission of Mr. Holbrooke to Belgrade to meet Milosevic and to convince him to not to have a military intervention and for peace. How did you experience that, and what was your role in that?
Actually, there were two last-ditch efforts made. Mr. Milosevic on the part of Mr. Holbrooke on the part of NATO. He was the one who delivered the threat. Say, okay, if you don't sign, NATO is going to intervene. And the negotiators, Mr. Hill, Mr. Majorsky, and myself, we were there at the same time. And actually, we had the first meeting with Mr. Milosevic and Mr. Milutinovic and foreign minister and so on. We were sitting there in Beli Dvor in the official residence of Mr. Milosevic, and we were trying to convince him, saying, "Listen, this is your last opportunity." Yeah. And I actually at the time thought very much of the Russian ambassador, Mr. Majorsky, because for the Americans, the alternative was clear, NATO. Yeah? For me, as a diplomat from a neutral country, although I was working for the EU, of course, the EU has no army. So it was not the preferred solution, military intervention. And above all, it was not the preferred solution for the Russians. Yeah. So, and there I thought, and I pushed very hard when I was talking there to Mr. Milosevic. It was also quite an, how should I say, a strange situation, because we knew this is our last chance. Yeah. And the interesting thing was that in Rambouillet, his negotiating team signaled that they could sign. Yeah? Not yet, but when we return after a hiatus of 3 weeks, then we continue, and then we do some last things, and then so they signaled very clearly, also in writing. The three negotiators received a letter from the Yugoslav delegation where they spelled out in detail what they accepted, that it was a quite respectful and good negotiation. We have made a lot of progress, but some things still need to be done, and we are ready upon the return to continue and to finish. When we were there in Belgrade, that was after the 3-week interruption, and after we spent 5 days in Paris, where no progress was made. And we could see already Milosevic obviously had decided against his negotiating team not to sign. So our last effort that you mentioned was to go there and say, here is your last chance. Please have a look, have another look, see to it, because if you do not sign, our job is over and NATO will take over. That was the reason why Mr. Holbrooke then came, and Mr. Holbrooke said, I have from NATO headquarters, Secretary General Solana and the member states of NATO, they are sending this message to you. Unless you sign, the intervention is going to happen. That was these were the last hours actually in Belgrade. And I was then the next day actually the last negotiator to leave. All the Americans had left already. And even the Russian called me up and said, listen, Moscow tells me to come back. And I thought I should stay as long as possible. Maybe there is a last chance. Unfortunately, there was not. Milosevic himself, this is my strong impression and conviction, he had decided they should bomb me and then I will be the hero, we will duck, and then they will stop bombing us. And then I can say, okay, I have not sold Kosovo. And when I left with my small team, we then went by car to Hungary, and in Hungary, in the evening, I got in radio already, Austrian radio, and I heard that the bombing in Belgrade had started. It was unbelievable for me because to imagine that a war would happen in my lifetime is something which clearly was not on my radar screen, but it indeed happened, and not just for 1 or 2 or 3 days, but for 74 days.
During the war, you were in Vienna or in Belgrade, or what was your?
I was in Vienna, and I actually, on behalf of the European Union, I was helping to get Mr. Rugova out of Pristina. That was very. He was really. I mean, his life was really threatened, and so we're talking. I spoke to the Yugoslav ambassador in Vienna and sent very clear signals that I mean, if they do something to Rugova, that is really, that would be extremely bad. And so we evacuated Mr. Rugova to Rome, and then I was there in Rome and met with Mr. Rugova. And another mission that I had was to talk to the government in Podgorica, because at the time you referred to it, Montenegro was had already moved away from Milosevic, and they were actually pro-Western. However, the bombardment, the military strikes also hit Montenegro, yeah, which I never understood why they could not. But what was more important even was the fact that my mission was to negotiate how to circumvent the oil embargo for Montenegro only, because they were pro-Western. So we thought, why should they be in such a situation? Why should they not? Let's alleviate their plight and see what we can do. And this is when I traveled then to Montenegro. And as you remember, of course, this was still part of Yugoslavia, and it was extremely difficult to get through. But there was a gentleman's agreement that certain Montenegrin cars with certain license plates would not be stopped by the Yugoslav security forces, Yugoslav army in Montenegro. And this is how I made it through there. And we had some meetings with Mr. Djukanovic and so on. And we found a way to circumvent the oil embargo.
So Montenegro stayed out of the war, basically didn't support.
Yeah.
And you were traveling during the war from Serbia to Montenegro?
No, from Austria, I went to Dubrovnik actually at the time, and we stayed in Cavtat overnight. And then we were taken to the border, and then from the Montenegrin side, our consul, Mr. Movaljevic, our honorary consul, came and he picked me up. and he had a car with a CD, and so he had a diplomatic car, and so he was not stopped, because if he would have been stopped and I would have been arrested, I think it would not have been a very good time for me. A third thing was actually, now comes to my mind, there was actually a Croatian journalist who was imprisoned by the Yugoslav security forces in Montenegro. And so we were trying to get him out, and eventually we succeeded to negotiate with Belgrade, and Belgrade said, okay, you can take him home.
On the 11th of April 99, there was this famous Serbian chief journalist, Slavko Ćurivila, who was killed from the Telegraph. Yeah? Did you meet him personally, or did you know him?
Yes, I knew him. I knew him. He was an excellent journalist, very courageous. And he was very much in opposition to Mr. Milosevic, and of course that was the reason why he was killed. I remember at the time also Mr. Djindjic was in, so to speak, in exile in Montenegro. And I visited him there also to talk. Of course, we were at the time also trying to find an alternative for Mr. Milosevic, to support the opposition. And Mr. Djindjic was the main force in the opposition, but he was threatened in Belgrade. So he went to Montenegro, where he felt a bit safer. And so I met with him there. We had talks about his assessment of the situation, what can be done, how do we go on after the war, and so on. As you know, I've met him many times, I must say. I was already then in Bosnia, and I visited him when he was the prime minister in 2002, and he was killed a year later.
It was, we all miss him. He was a great European hero. It was a tragic thing in 2003 on the 12th of March. But then the war stopped in the June 2000. In the 11th of June 99. There was the armistice of Kumanovo. What was your experience, and where were you at during this Kumanovo agreement?
Well, actually, the preparations for the agreement were done in Bonn, Petersburg. That's the old capital of Germany, and I was involved there in hammering out the compromise, a formula in order to under which conditions NATO would stop bombing and so on. And these things happened there in Petersburg for several days, and it was the Americans who were there, of course, and then Mr. Ahtisaari was charged with the Russian to fly during the war still to Belgrade to talk to Mr. Milosevic. I was not part of it. I stayed behind because they also wanted to send a fresh face there. And I remember when we were talking about preparing for this meeting in Belgrade, Mr. Ahtisaari said, we have to be very careful. We cannot travel too often to Belgrade. Obviously, we were all thinking it's going to be extremely difficult, a long negotiation, many meetings going back and forth, and it didn't happen. It was actually on the first meeting in Belgrade, thanks to the Russians, I must say, who signaled to Milosevic that they are taking their support away from him, that Milosevic then finally gave in. And then the Kumanovo agreement was signed a couple of days later.
So it was President Yeltsin's intervention which was decisive?
Yes, it was definitely President Yeltsin who, whatever the reasons were, but I think that Milosevic had become a liability for Yeltsin, because at the time in 1999, Yeltsin, remember, he was actually signaling that Russia could join NATO. It was this idea of a pan-European peace order. Yeah? So when we speak today about it, it all sounds so unreal. But at the time, that was at the turn of the century, there was a huge opportunity, a historic opportunity, which was not realized as we know now.
Then after the peace agreement, or no, the armistice was signed in Kumanovo, it was like this, that actually there was a surprising decision for me. I wanted to ask you for that, because normally I thought it would have been logical you take a big role in the management of UNMIK Kosovo, but you were later then appointed to be the high representative in Bosnia, another new republic. And you have the opportunity to help the Bosnians for 2.5 years in a very important phase. Can you describe how the events went like this and your contributions and central points for Bosnian reform?
Okay, you remind me, there was, I handed over officially my mandate to the United Nations Special Representative in Pristina. This was De Mello, who was a UN official who was later on killed in Iraq. And I still remember we had in a small room that was rented, we were together, and then the German assistant of mine said, he knows best, he will stay with you, and also my Austrian assistant. So this was the nucleus of this UN team, actually. The fellow stayed on for a couple of weeks, and then Mr. Kouchner came to be the first regular representative, UN special representative for Kosovo. And as I said, my assistant, both they worked for a while for Mr. Kouchner, because these two guys had, of course, learned a lot in these turbulent times before in Kosovo, traveling and negotiating, and then in Rambouillet, where they were with me, my assistants, and so on. So this was this kind of handover, and at the time I already had the Germans, actually, who of course saw me performing as in Rambouillet, and they had asked me whether I would have whether I would be interested in Bosnia. And I was actually surprised, because I said, I mean, the first high representative there was Carl Bildt, the former prime minister of Sweden. The second was a Spaniard who was a foreign minister. And the Germans said, oh, well, we are not so happy with politicians. We want an expert. And this is how it happened, actually, that Mr. Schröder then proposed my candidacy, and yeah, this is how I then ended up in 1999, in August of 1999, in Sarajevo.
And this was very important contribution as well for Balkan peace, because you, in your time as a high representative, you could start the European accession process of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and especially lead Bosnia-Herzegovina into the Council of Europe. That's kind of historic. Can you describe the challenges, how it was? And
well, the biggest challenge that I saw there immediately was that actually the return process, the refugee return process, had come to a stop in the middle of 1999. Yeah. Why? Because all those refugees who could go back to Bosnia, they wanted to be in the villages, in the towns where they were in the majority, where their ethnic group was in the majority. But the problem was, in order to undo this ethnic cleansing, you need to get the refugees back where they constituted a minority. Yeah? And of course, this is exactly what the war was all about. To clean up, so to speak, the situation and create only majority areas. Yeah? for Serbs, for Bosniaks, for Croats. They were all fighting for this. Yeah? And our intention, of course, was, according to the Dayton Accords, that there is a right to return to your original home. And you have a right to the property repossession. This is a historically important difference to all the other previous peace accords. Like when you think of the Middle East, even today, Palestinians are not allowed to return to their villages who are in Israel. Yeah. So in Bosnia, that was in terms of human rights actually a big progress, but it was only on paper. Yeah? So when I got acquainted with the situation, I said, okay, and we had the first foreign ministers meeting in New York in September of 1999. I said, okay, we have to take a very big decision. Either we say this what we did so far, more is not possible, or you give me the authority to do whatever I can in order to bring the rest of the hundreds of thousands of refugees back to Bosnia. And we had already a plan prepared, and the foreign ministers, they agreed and gave it the necessary money and the experts and all this stuff. We built a huge organization within the office of the High Representative. We also coordinated with the UN refugee organization, with the OSCE, with the international peace forces, because it was always people were afraid to go back. So you had to somehow guarantee security. But security alone is not enough. You also need most of the big houses were destroyed. So you need to rebuild, you need to electricity, you need schools, you need roads and so on. So this huge task was actually done in such a way that even an NGO, Human Rights Watch, who usually criticizes governments, said in 2000 in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there was a breakthrough in refugee return. So even they recognized that that obviously we had done a job that was quite all right. That was the first point, of course, to get the refugees back, to reconstruct. But the second big issue was clearly what we call state building. When I arrived there was a central government, a state government. There were two ministers and one prime minister. No ministries, no bureaucracy, no nothing. Yeah? Because the Dayton Accords had given the two entities, the Republika Srpska and the Bosniak Croat Federation, most of the power. Yeah? But clearly a modern state needs a central government. Yeah? And so that was my second biggest task, and we succeeded in doubling the size, the number of the ministries. We established the state border service. The borders inside of Bosnia were closed, so to speak, between the ethnicities. But to the outside, to Croatia and to Serbia, the borders were open. Yeah? So what we did was to establish a state border service, control on because there was, of course, a corruption unimaginable, yeah, and clearly the things were going back and forth, and organized crime and all these issues. When you have a state that doesn't function, yeah, you use this state clearly and the territory of the state in order to make your dubious business. So that was and the third issue was, of course, the economy. Economy was destroyed. I mean, 95% of the factories of everything was basically destroyed. Yeah? So we really had to start from scratch and rebuild, or rather build a new economy there. That was not so successful, I must say. It still will take quite some time, but we know wars, be they in Kosovo or in Bosnia, they destroy the very fabric of a society, particularly when there are civil wars, when people who know each other fighting each other. Yeah? And that's really something which we need to keep in mind, why we need to continue to support Kosovo, why we need to continue to support Bosnia-Herzegovina and all the countries in the region who were affected by this terrible war.
Mr. Ambassador, one of your big legacy issue was the Srebrenica Memorial Site and the Srebrenica Foundation to keep the memory and commemorate the genocide in Bosnia. Can you explain how that worked and what you did to achieve that?
Well, this was definitely one of my most emotional decisions and work that I had to do there. 3 years after the genocide, slowly the victims were unearthed, were found, because there were mass graves, and we had a special organization who was looking into this issue, who did the mass excavation and all this stuff. And then the question was what to do with the dead bodies who were sometimes, scattered around. And when I spoke to the survivors in Srebrenica, they had organizations already, mothers of Srebrenica and so on. And they said, well, we want to have our loved ones buried nearby. Now, Srebrenica, and where the whole tragedy started in Potocari, which is a bit outside of Srebrenica, is in the middle of the Republika Srpska, so in Serb territory. And when I then spoke to my international interlocutors, particularly NATO, said, well, we cannot guarantee the safety and the security of this memorial and the burial ground, because this is in the middle of enemy territory, so to speak. Yeah? And clearly, Srebrenica is extremely important for the Muslim side, but it is also in a negative way important for the Serbs, because they want to deny it. They don't want to, many still do not live up to say, okay, we have to take responsibility. Yeah. And we know, again, as an Austrian, we know how difficult it was for Austrians who were active in World War II and then also in the Holocaust, to say we share a certain responsibility, although we did not do it. But we, as Austrians, we who live in this territory where the Holocaust was, so to speak, part, we need to face this responsibility. It took, remember, it took many years till this happened. So in this way, what I did was, of course, forcing this this responsibility on the Serb side. And I still remember when I spoke to the then president of Republika Srpska, and I told him, listen, this is what I'm going to do. This is the wish and the will of the people. They want to have the cemetery in Potocari. They want to have a memorial there. You will. I tell you, you are responsible for this, for the safety and the security. It is, and if you don't, and if anything happens, you will be responsible for this. And of course, I must say, I had the so-called bond powers, which means that I could fire political officials and so on. And so I said, listen, if something happens, you will lose your political function. And I must say, the Serbs did a very responsible job. And actually, although there were some minor things happening there, but all in all now, this Srebrenica is established there. There are close to 7,000 already buried there. I go there from time to time on the anniversary. And there's the memorial site is also there. And I think it is very important. We need to remember what has happened, and it will, in the end, they are again convinced. In the end, reconciliation can only take place over the graves of Srebrenica, meaning Serbs will have to recognize and that they have a responsibility for this. And then they can go on and find a way to reconcile. Again, this is a European thing. Remember, the French and the Germans were fighting for, I don't know how many wars, 3, 4 wars within 50 years in the 19th century, up to then 20th century, World War I, World War II, 80, and so on. So, but then two courageous politicians decided, Mr. Adenauer and Mr. de Gaulle, we will stop this carnage. We will not go to war against each other any longer. And this moment is still missing in Bosnia. And this is actually the reason why so many problems, economic problems, political problems are around, because they have not yet faced up to this responsibility.
So you think this kind of Verdun moment where Helmut Kohl and Mitterrand were crossing their hands on the battlefield of Verdun, and this is missing still on the Balkans between the warring nations of the 90s?
Absolutely. And when you think Verdun was 1917, and this was in the 1990s with Monsieur Mitterrand and Mr. Kohl, of course they had already beforehand, but you have to keep this always in mind, and you have to renew this pledge over time. It cannot be just a one-off and then everything will be fine. No, it's hard work, and we need this in the Balkans. We need this in former Yugoslavia. This will free the minds and politics to turn finally to what people really need, and they need a good life.
Mr. Petritsch, you have also been the chairman of the Vienna Succession Committee of former Yugoslavia, the Vienna Convention on the dissolution and the property issues between the new countries. When you see now, looking back, and the future of all 7 countries who came out of Yugoslavia, what is your recommendation? Do you support EU membership of all of them, NATO membership? Do you see some kind of unity in Europe for all the countries?
I think when we speak about the Southeastern Europe, former Yugoslavia, or the Western Balkans, or whatever you call it, actually, we are not really talking about the EU enlargement. We're talking about the consolidation of Europe. And the Balkans is an integral part in history, in the bad and the good things that have happened. The Balkans is part of it. And we need to recognize, even if we have other seemingly bigger problems. Particularly as Austrians, we are in so many ways connected with this region that we need to be the champion. We need to be the ones who talk in Brussels, in Paris, in Rome, in Berlin, and so on, and make clear that Europe needs this part. This will not be a Europe that we envision if the Balkans is not We have much more difficult decisions today. Think of Ukraine, think of Turkey. I mean, these are really difficult questions where we do not know what the outcome will be. Here in the Balkans, I should say this is very clear, an integral part of Europe, and consequently, the European Union needs to welcome these countries. However, I must add this. This is not a one-way street, and it always needs two to tango. You need the governments in the region, you need civil society, you need this European spirit to emanate from these countries themselves. Democracy, rule of law, the fight against corruption, organized crime, and above all, to see that that this European spirit of a liberal society takes root there. This is still something, you can see this also in Eastern Europe. Even in Austria, we are not always so successful when it comes to the rule of law and so on. So this needs to make ourselves also a bit more realistic and a bit more understanding. But if there is a friendship in politics, then we need to be clear in expressing ourselves and telling the people there, politics, of course, yes, you're welcome, but you need to take your share and you need to do the necessary reforms in order to then become a member of the European Union.
Mr. Ambassador, now we are at the end of the interview. Just one positive statement I would like to make. Some Slovenia, Croatia already in NATO and EU. 3 countries, Albania, Montenegro, Macedonia already in NATO and on the way to the EU. But unfortunately, Bosnia, Serbia and Kosovo still not mutually recognized and still open issues. Are you optimistic for the coming 2-3 years there will be a breakthrough? And what is your kind of wish for the coming 2-3 years, what you would like to see in the region in terms of reconciliation, mutual recognition, and peace and unification, integration in the EU?
We need to move in a persistent way and continuously closer to the goal. And it's not so much the goal to be a member of the European Union. I think the way towards the European Union is very important. And this is something where maybe Austria is more more in a capacity to support this kind of day-to-day work that needs to be done. I think in 3 years we are going to be much closer. I believe, I really am convinced that that these countries are going to become members. But when this will be, I do not know. But I believe that we need to establish a better and more structured way forward, so that people, and this is a certain tendency in these former communist countries, to wait till somebody else does something for you. We need to really activate the people there. We need to encourage them, and we need to give them the necessary means in order to reform their own countries. Rule of law, as I have said, is crucial. This is without a country that has a country that has no rule of law can never be successful in the European Union. That's just, it's not just that that these countries have maybe a corrupt government or something. This will keep these people there away from the European Union. So work there and we will support you. And I think this is the task that Austria has, to be in a way this kind of example that progress is possible, but it is a long way.
Ambassador, one closing statement from you, because you know the region very well, you travel there, you are also very active in all the countries, also for our international audience. Do you see a lot of progress in terms of infrastructure, living conditions, security, now in the old countries of the Western Balkans? Also, how is the situation from your assessment?
Well, I mean, now for almost 30 years after the war, I must say, a huge progress has been achieved, even in those countries that still have a lot of problems. So it is safe to travel. The infrastructure is being improved with the help of the European Union. I think we also must not be too fearful when external partners come in, like the Russians or the Chinese. If our model is the better one, we can convince the governments, we can convince the people that the European model is the better one. Yeah, and we just need to think, well, who actually would if people there had a choice, would you like to live in China or in Russia or in Europe? Of course, they will all decide for Europe. So this is the big advantage that we have. And this is also needed and necessary for the companies who invest there. We know Austrian companies are number one or number two when it comes to FDI in the whole region. I think the governments in this region need to become even more active and lure investments in there, produce high quality products that can be exported, and do their job, which they not always do. But I'm optimistic. I think this will happen. The progress is there, and it will continue. But it needs hard work on all sides.
So thanks, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for your contribution to bring Austria to the European Union. Thanks also for all the things you did for Balkan peace, for progress, for prosperity. Many, many millions of people have better living conditions because of your contribution. Thanks, Mr. Ambassador. And thanks a lot also for talking to Pax Europiana for this podcast now. And now I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot. Jetzt höre ich